Week 2, Lesson 7, Dick Tracy. Chester Gould was born in 1900 and died in 1985. He was a cartoonist, and for the purposes of this course, the most interesting thing about him was that he might be the first person we've discussed here whose lifelong ambition was to be a cartoonist. He spent years sending newspaper editors samples of his comic, until one day, one finally became a hit. In 1931, a streetwise detective named Plainclothes Tracy, created by Chester Gould, hit newspaper stands in a dark, gritty look at Chicago crime. Plainclothes Tracy's name was quickly changed to Dick Tracy, and he quickly became one of the biggest comic book protagonists in history. When Dick Tracy started, it was the first realistic comic strip about police ever made. It was violent, it wasn't afraid to hurt the main protagonist in a non-comedic fashion. Tracy would get shot, his adopted kid would get violently beaten up by criminals, and people couldn't get enough of it. This was the beginning of crime fiction in comics. In the 1930s, Chicago was known for its gangsters. Gangsters like Al Capone, Bugs Moran, Tony Accardo, John Dillinger, Lester M. Gillis, aka Babyface Nelson, and at the same time elsewhere in the country, Bonnie and Clyde were also causing some chaos. They were sensational. They were in newspapers, making headlines, and appearing on newsreels before matinees. At the time, Prohibition was being enforced in the United States, which clearly many people disagreed with. Stopping many Americans from seeing the gangsters is outright evil. People wanted to see more of them. But Americans also loved their heroes, and they wanted to see their heroes come out on top and save the day. So, Dick Tracy would always manage to solve his case. But there was another major influence Dick Tracy had on the future of comics, and that was its pacing. Like Little Orphan Annie, Dick Tracy quickly began to tell ongoing stories, with beginnings, middles, and ends. These became formulaic from an early stage. They started with someone committing a crime. Dick Tracy would come over to the crime scene and predict who did it. Tracy would then track down the main villain and their goons for a month to 2 months. Tracy would capture them and then think about his home life. This non-stop action in the news strips had a huge influence on many of the dramatic comics that followed. However, there was another major influence from the comic. In September 8th, 1932, a street kid, who would later be known as Dick Tracy Jr., appeared. Dick Tracy Jr. was a kid who'd do a lot of errands and spying for his hero/father, Dick Tracy. The importance of this is that Dick Tracy Jr., to the best of my research, is the first kid sidekick in comics, something that was to become a staple of the medium in the following decade. Dick Tracy also had a romantic interest in the dame Tess Trueheart, who would later become his wife. But his love life would have to take a backseat to the crimes he was solving. We almost never saw what Dick Tracy did on his time off. Everything had to revolve around the cases he was following. This changed about 2 decades later when soap opera aspects were introduced into his home life. But when he first made an impression on the public, Tracy's life was all about stopping crime. The comic proved popular enough that new comic strips had been created constantly since his creation, and are still being made today. So why is Dick Tracy important for this course? Because he's the first successful example of crime comics, which, as we'll see later, become very important to the history of the comic book medium. Questions to contemplate. Compared to some of the other characters in this course, Dick Tracy can be overlooked when people think about comic icons. Why do you think this is? Dick Tracy was a creation of his time, dealing with Chicago-style gangsters. Is Dick Tracy still relevant today, now that crime has changed so much?